thereabouts, and so we'll know how the room situation is shape jobs. Okay, we're ready to go. There's a lot that's been happening since Eustace Mullins last was with us. It's time to be brought up to date as far as our world situation and what's going on in the financial area, our governmental areas. Eustace Mullins, in case he's new to you, and he will be to a few of you, as far as I'm concerned, is the granddaddy of the people who tried to inform us about the Federal Reserve System through his book, which was 30 years or so ago, on the secrets of the Federal Reserve. A book that has been copied time and time again by other authors, or a great deal of the information on it has been copied, and other books have been sold on that same subject. Of course, he'd entered into the field of health and that area too, and has written books on vaccines and poison needle?
Murder by injection.
Murder by injection, okay. Anyway, among others. But we're happy he's back with us after about a 5 or 6 year layoff. Welcome, Eustace, back with us again this afternoon.
Well, I never miss a chance to come to Denver. The government sent me out here in 1943 to the Air Force, and I've been coming back ever since. And I came down here from another beautiful area, British Columbia, Salmon Arm. We had a great meeting up there. But Denver, the Mile High City, has always been a favorite place. And I met a political prisoner in 1948 in Washington, D.C., who was being held without trial. And the reason he was being held without trial was that he had opposed our going into the Second World War for very good reasons. So they locked him up without trial. They had 4 government psychiatrists say that he was incompetent to participate in his own defense. What that meant was he intended to stand by everything he had ever said. And the government does not like that. So they held him without trial. So I came along, and he suggested I go down to the Library of Congress and see what I could find out about the Federal Reserve System. Well, what I found out was that when you scratched anything, I don't care what it was, the medical monopoly, the money monopoly, the legal monopoly, you would find the Federal Reserve at the bottom of it. And it's responsible for all of the criminal activities of the government because it prints the money to pay for it. Now, there was a French philosopher named Proudhon about 150 years ago. He said, all government is a crime. He didn't say some government. He said all government is a crime. Why is all government a crime? Because law enforcement is an essential part of government. And when you're in government, then you don't have to enforce the law against yourself. You don't have to arrest yourself and put yourself in jail. So it's very tempting to criminal minds to be in a position where they will never have to pay for their crimes. And that's the essential draw of government service, as they call it. Well, the banking monopoly, which the Federal Reserve represents, it's a consortium of central banks, and their modest proposal is to rob every one of the 6 billion inhabitants of the entire world. And they seem to be doing it. So how is a central bank different from other banks? A central bank, first of all, gets itself a government license to print money, to print all the money they want to print. So that gives you a good start when you get that. Now, the second job of a central bank is to finance war. And all governments like to go to war every once in a while, but it's a very expensive proposition, and war finance has always been a big problem. When they discovered the central bank, they now had a bank which could finance any war anywhere in the world. And we did not have world wars until the Federal Reserve System was adopted by Congress in 1913. 1913, a few months later, we had World War I. Then we had to repeat, we had World War II. Now, the second thing about a central bank is because it gives you what they call an elastic currency, which means you can print all the money you want. With an elastic currency, you always have the problem of hyperinflation. Printing too much money and the money begins to devalue itself to where it takes a wheelbarrow full of money to buy a loaf of bread. So to control that, the central bank people came up with the income tax. When they paid people a salary, they would make sure to draw back a certain amount of it in tax to sop up the excess printing so that it would keep the supply of money within reason. And that's all the income tax is, because obviously if the bankers can print all the money they want to, then they don't need to reach into your pocket and take 35% of your salary. But they do it as a control mechanism, not only to control the supply of money, but also to control you. And all the political parties today depend upon Federal Reserve money. That's why you have the Federal Reserve Democratic Party and you have the Federal Reserve Republican Party. In 1992, I was lecturing, doing a talk show in Idaho during the time of the Ruby Ridge Massacre. And so the interviewer asked me, he said, well, who are these police who are attacking this man and his family? I said, they are the Federal Reserve Police. He said, the Federal Reserve System has no police force. I said, all the police are Federal Reserve police. Who do you think pays their salaries? So then he cut me off the air. One of the few times I've ever been cut off. When I said the Federal Reserve Police, they actually cut me off, stopped that, and we were only 8 minutes into the program. So I learned never to use that phrase again. It's a very unfortunate phrase. But I have closed down quite a few talk shows by talking about the Federal Reserve System, I'll tell you. There was one guy here in Denver, I closed him down 3 times. Lopez, his name was Larry Lopez something. And 3 different times he had a talk show and he had me on, they closed him down. A couple years later, he'd get another and say, Eustace, come back on. I said, okay. I did. They closed him down again. Lopez Alexander, that was his name. But I guess the highlight of my television career was a friend got me on the Martin Downey talk show about 8 years ago. And at that time, Martin Downey was the Regis Philbin of the television business. He had the most exciting, fastest growing television talk show in the United States. So this friend said, why don't you have Eustace on and talk about the Federal Reserve? Well, Martin was a real live wire, and he thought, well, this sounds good. So he had me come up to Newark and get on his show, and we started talking about the Federal Reserve System, and he was a good interviewer. He asked me good questions, and I gave him the right answers on everything about how the Federal Reserve operated. Well, the next day, they canceled all of Martin Downey's advertising contracts, and the poor guy never worked another day. He's been down and out ever since. He developed lung cancer. He's down in Texas somewhere. And I really felt bad about it, but at the same time, there's a certain risk to having me around. I don't always warn people, but it works out that way. Because these people, with their money, can be very vindictive. And they will spend any amount of money to get you out of their way if they consider you a problem, which they obviously consider me a problem. And they considered my mentor, Ezra Pound, a problem. And of course, he had his revenge by having me write the Federal Reserve book. And also, 10 years later, I got him out of prison. When all the leading lights in Washington said, Ezra Pound will never be released. He's going to spend the rest of his life in that place. And I talked to a congressman. And the congressman went before Congress and he said, why is the government holding this man? And there was no answer. So they had an 8-minute hearing and they released him. He walked out. That was it. after 13 and a half years without trial. So, if you have somebody to speak up for you at the right time, it certainly helps matters. But the Federal Reserve System itself, by running the entire political system of the United States, which it does, it raises the money, it gives the candidates the money, and it lets them contend with each other. And there's only one requirement, and that is never criticize the Federal Reserve System. So they don't. And you'll never hear one of them doing it. In 1992, George Bush and Ross Perot and Billy Clinton, they were on television, and they were all three to debate each other. And the only thing they agreed on was the Federal Reserve System. Each one was asked by the interrogator, what do you think of the Federal Reserve System? Each one said, I would not change a thing with the Federal Reserve System. I think it is doing a fine job. So you got this from the Republican, and you got this from the Democrat, and you got it from the so-called independent Ross Perot. Well, Ross Perot was a billionaire, and billionaires are the least independent people you'll ever meet in your life. They have to toe the line every minute, because that $1 billion can go just like that. They know how to take it away from them, and they know it, so they are the best behaved people of all. So how did the Federal Reserve System get this power over everybody? Well, actually, they got an early start. Immediately after the American Revolution, President George Washington was persuaded by Alexander Hamilton to charter the first bank of the United States, which was the central bank, backed by the Rothschilds of London. So along comes President Thomas Jefferson when the charter was to be renewed, and he refused to renew it because he was a great opponent of the central bank, and I have his statement on that and as a foreword in my book. Out of revenge, the Bank of England attacked the United States. That was the War of 1812, and you will not find this in any history book, that the War of 1812 was perpetrated on the American people as an act of revenge because Jefferson refused to renew the charter of the Bank of the United States. In fact, I have a little monetary history of the United States which traces every war, every financial panic that we have had in our history, and every one of it was precipitated by the bankers. They motivate everything. So we had a hero of the War of 1812 named President Andrew Jackson, won the battle in New Orleans. He became president, and by that time we had a second Bank of the United States. These people never quit. And so he got very incensed about this, and he said to the bankers, he said, "Ye are vipers, and by God, I will rout you out." So he withdrew all of the government funds from the Second Bank of the United States. Of course, it collapsed. That was in 1836. So the Bank of England retaliated by issuing an order that no American paper was to be honored. No American security, stock, bond. You couldn't get a penny for it because the bank put out the word, "We won't take it." That caused the first great financial panic in the United States, Panic of 1837. And also, ever since then, when they draw up the list of the most admired presidents, Andrew Jackson is at the bottom of the list. Every one of the presidents who opposed the bankers, they're always denounced by the academics and the press, know-nothings, incompetents, idiots, and of course, for that one reason alone, because they would not do what the bankers wanted. So therefore, they go down in history to be vilified for the rest of their life. In fact, two of my mentors, Ezra Pound and Senator Joe McCarthy, are still vilified by the press whenever they mention their names. They always call Ezra Pound the crazy traitor. He was never adjudged insane, and he was never convicted of treason. They call him the crazy traitor. With Joe McCarthy, they say everyone he accused was totally innocent, which of course is ridiculous. In fact, the great fear of left-wing people during the McCarthy era was that they would not be called before the McCarthy Committee. Because if you got called before the McCarthy Committee, your reputation was made for life. But if they didn't call you, then you had missed the boat. Nobody ever heard of you. So it was a big thing. And the people that really hated McCarthy were the people he'd never called. So that's the little paradox that you run into. But after the Panic of 1837, the Rothschilds in London decided the United States was growing so rapidly and getting so rich. And one of the reasons was we had great health care in this country. We had homeopathy and naturopathy. And the people were just so darn healthy they could work 18 hours a day and nothing was ever wrong with them. This went on to 1913 when John D. Rockefeller decided to take over the medical profession and switch us from homeopathy to German allopathic medicine, which used a lot of drugs and radical surgery and also was very profitable. So since then, Americans have been getting sicker and sicker and sicker because we got away from that natural life that is so good for American people. And now we're taking all these expensive drugs, and they now even publish the side effects. They advertise on television. This drug will damage your liver, it'll damage your kidneys, it'll damage your heart, and people take them anyway. Because the medical profession tells you the benefits will outweigh the risks. I mean, you may have a medical problem, but a damaged liver and a damaged kidneys, that's not going to bother you. Don't worry about it. So that's the logic behind the medical profession today. And the reason I mention that is because the man behind the Federal Reserve System was John D. Rockefeller, same man who was behind the takeover of the medical profession. What I found out after many years was no matter what monopoly I went into, I was dealing with the same small cast of characters. So my work got easier and easier. I just rewrote the same thing about everybody I was writing about. Whether they were in the oil monopoly, the medical profession, legal monopoly, politics, it was all the same crowd of people. Because this was a closed shop. They always kept everybody out except their old, small, elite crowd. And that's the way they operated. So when they decided to split this country up into two small countries, two Balkan countries, President Lincoln wanted to fight. So he called the bankers in from New York and he said, well, we're going to have a war. Now I need some money. They said, sure, we'll give you money. How much you need? And he told them. And they said, the interest rate will be 19%. Well, the interest rate at that time was 1%. So what they were telling Lincoln was, we're not going to let you have any money because nobody could pay 19%. And so Lincoln asked around and he found out he could go to the Treasury Department and they would print the money. It was right there in the Constitution, Article 1, Section 8. Congress shall control money. And the Treasury was part of the government. So he had greenbacks printed up and he financed the Civil War. But this was non-interest bearing currency. So all the money we have is promissory notes and it carries interest because it's issued against interest-bearing bonds. So your dollar bill in your pocket is carrying 10% interest, which is very profitable for the bankers. And so the bankers lost all the interest on that money in the Civil War, so they assassinated President Lincoln. So 100 years later, we have a bright young president from Harvard, and of course they never taught him any history at Harvard. And this President Kennedy, he asked some of his associates, he says, now what can I do to really get through to the American people and get them behind you? So one of his advisors said, why don't you get the Federal Reserve System off the backs of the American people? They'll put a statue up to you in every town in the country. So Kennedy said, well, that sounds pretty good. As I say, you never heard about Lincoln's problem. And so he went to the Treasury Department and had them print up greenback notes. They're collector's items today. And so immediately the bankers had Lyndon Johnson as vice presidential candidate, who was he had already decided to dump him. And Johnson said, Mr. President, we have a little problem down in Dallas, and we need you to come down there, and that'll get the party back on the track. So when Kennedy went to Dallas, they had 5 different assassination teams waiting for him because they couldn't afford to miss out on this one. And the one that did him in was a group from Marseille, professional Sicilian hitmen. They were the ones that did the job. And of course, Oswald was drinking Coca-Cola and had no idea what was going on. But he was the guy that they blamed for it. And so this was your bankers again, running the show the way that they want to. And of course, I was a child of the Great Depression. And I remember those dark days in the early 30s when my father was out of work, had 6 children to feed, had no idea how to feed them. And this brings us to a very important point. Now, you've heard a lot here about longevity and vitamins and health. But let me tell you, the Federal Reserve System is the greatest threat to your health and security that you will ever have in your life. Because there were many, many, many nervous breakdowns and suicides and deaths caused during the Depression by people who simply could not carry on. They were just crushed by this terrible thing that had happened to them. They were good workers, and suddenly they had no jobs, they had no way of feeding their families, and this is the most crushing thing that can happen to you. So I never thought at that time that I'd spend the rest of my life finding out who these criminals were who put over the Great Depression. But Congressman Charles Lindbergh warned the Congress and the American people during the great debate on the Federal Reserve System in 1913. He said, this is the money trust, and if you enact this bill, your children will be enslaved and they will curse you. Well, he was exactly right, because in the Depression, the children had no food, and their parents were out of work. And, but it was a great thing for the money crowd. They, of course, had sold all their stocks in 1929, just before the crash. Now, they took the cash and bought everything up for a penny on the dollar, just like they did in 1837 in the first panic we had in this country. It was the Rothschild representatives in the United States who went in and bought up the railroad stocks and the factory stocks for pennies because they had the only cash in town. And they just take over everything. Now, when Alan Greenspan, our present chairman of the Federal Reserve Board, started his rate increases last year, and he put through 6 rate increases, and he was out to bankrupt the American people. Now, the most respected financial television commentator is Louis Rickhauser, Wall Street Week. So after Greenspan had been up to his deviltry for about 5 months, and my own stock portfolio was dropping at the rate of $10,000 a week, and every stock that I had was perfectly good, but with these rate increases, it was making money tight, and the stocks were going down. It had nothing to do with the value of the stocks whatsoever. It was a typical financial maneuver to rob the American people. And so I was one of the people being robbed, and I was pretty sore about it. So I saw in Time magazine a joke about Alan Greenspan on March the 13th. And it said, how many Federal Reserve chairmen does it take to change a light bulb? And the answer is 1. So Greenspan holds the bulb, and the rest of the world revolves around him. And this is simply the situation that we have. We have a situation where the bankers are so powerful, one man has all the power. In every presidential election, a point has come up that the Federal Reserve Chairman is more powerful than any presidential candidate. And he will decide who is going to be the next president. So they've decided that George Bush will be the next president. So therefore, Alan Greenspan is calling the turn, and that's why we had the 6 rate increases. He had 5 more interest rate increases up his sleeve in case he needed more. I don't think he's going to need any more because they've achieved their objectives, but that is to have a change of administration. And they want you to believe that a great change is coming and that there won't be any more interns in the Oval Office and so forth. But in fact, it's the same old crowd. Bush's father was head of the CIA before he became president and ambassador to China, where the biggest opium fields in the world are, the Golden Triangle, the world drug trade. So we're exchanging a sexual psychopath for a dope dealer is really what it amounts to. So let's hope it will be and approve it. Let's be optimistic. But I'm not promising you anything. Now, during Greenspan's rate increases, he was talking about hypothetical inflation. Hypothetical inflation is something that exists only in his own mind. No one else knows what it is. No one's ever seen it. But he was complaining about low unemployment and prosperity. We were having the greatest prosperity we've ever had. And Greenspan said, this is the wealth factor, and we have got to close in on it. In other words, he didn't want to see any of you making any money. So Louis Rukeyser said on Wall Street Week, he was asked by one of his Wall Street broker friends there, they said, Louis, what do you think's going on here? And Louis said, well, it's commonly known that rich people get nervous when they see ordinary people getting too much money. And so they take it away from them. And that's exactly what was going on. Greenspan was trying to close down the money that was going to the people of the United States who were working hard. They were getting vacation homes. They were getting second cars. And that's when they pulled the rug out from under you. Because they're making money off of it anyway, but it's that jealousy. They don't want to see you have any independence or any authority. They want you to stay peasants, and they will make their move to try to bring that about. So this is the big gap between what they call the rich and the poor. In fact, it's no fun being rich when everybody else starts getting money. So the only way to enjoy your money is to make sure nobody else has any. And this is exactly what the Federal Reserve System does. They rob everybody, and so then the rich feel very secure. They say, well, we have our limousines and our chauffeurs, and everybody else is riding bicycles, like in China. And that's what they want. They want a Chinese country. They want a country of peons who will be absolutely subservient to the will of the big rich. And the Federal Reserve System itself was simply a plan whereby the richest people in the world would get even richer. When they had a secret meeting on Jekyll Island to plan the central bank plan and put it over on Congress, the membership of the Jekyll Island Club represented 1/6 of the wealth of the entire world. These weren't poor people who were trying to make a fortune on their own. They had their fortune. All they were interested in was seeing that nobody else ever made a fortune. So all of the prosperity that we have had has been made in spite of the government, in spite of the Federal Reserve System. Because they've been in there all the way fighting you. They don't want you to make any money. They take it away from you in taxes. They take it away from you in the income tax. And the income tax itself was the vital part of the Federal Reserve Act of 1913. It was an amendment, a separate amendment to the Constitution, but its only purpose was to make sure that the American people would never have the independence which their own earning power would guarantee them. And to do that, the income tax amendment was prepared by the leading Wall Street lawyers of the people who put over the Federal Reserve System, Rockefeller, J.P. Morgan. They had their lawyers prepare the income tax amendment. Philander Knox was a lawyer from Oregon. He was Secretary of State and put it to Congress. And it was also drafted by Elihu Root, who was the lawyer for many of the wealthy people in New York. J.P. Morgan said, when I call in a lawyer and ask him if I can do something, he will tell me that I cannot do it. But he said, when I call in Elihu Root, he will tell me exactly how I can do what I want to do. So Elihu Root was such a great operator for the billionaires, that Woodrow Wilson sent him to Russia in 1917 with $100 million of his personal war fund to salvage the Bolshevik Revolution in Russia. Because the very minute they had the Bolshevik Revolution, it collapsed almost before it started, because it was perpetrated by real zanies. These were people who had spent most of their lives in libraries studying books, so they thought they could run the world. Well, I would say that a lot of our politicians in Washington probably have the same training, but these people will goof up anything that they get into, because people with ability will get into a field where they can achieve something, not where they can rob other people, not where they can mess up the government. They really want to accomplish something in life. Now, what you have in Washington is the non-achievers, the people who could never make it in business. I had an uncle in business in Washington, and I went up to visit him, and he said, you know, no business person in Washington, this was during the 1930s, said no business person in Washington would ever hire anyone who had worked for the government. And if you put on your resume you'd had a government job, you couldn't get a job in private business anywhere in Washington. That's changed now, of course, but that's the way it was during the 1930s. So you can see that these people are incompetent by the very way that the campaign, the president's campaign at the present time, is being waged. Bush and Gore are actually waging the campaign of 1936. Because I was alive then, and I remember they were saying exactly the same thing. The Democrats were saying we need more government programs. The Republicans were saying we have got to cut taxes. And the Democrats were saying the Republicans are the party of the rich. Although the real millionaires, the Harrimans and the Rockefellers, were all Democrats. But the Democrats will always call the Republicans the party of the rich. And the big money is really behind the Democrats. When you got Rockefellers, you got the richest people. And there are J. Rockefellers in the Senate as a senator from West Virginia. Why isn't he a senator from New York? Because rich people are always very cheap. And he looked around to find the cheapest state in the United States he could buy, and it was West Virginia. So he bought West Virginia and became the senator from West Virginia. It would have cost him 10 times as much to be a senator from New York. And these guys are very tight, especially when it comes to their own money. So we had these two presidential candidates right now waging the campaign of 1936, and the people were bored to death. There was no interest in the campaign because they'd heard it all before. It was a one-note thing. But then something happened which changed the whole structure of this political race. And that was the news leaked out that the federal government is sitting on a $44 trillion surplus. It's still not been officially published yet. But you see, here they were talking about the $4 trillion debt when they have $44 trillion in cash. How did they get all this money? It was because of the prosperity. Because the more prosperity we have, the more the influx of taxes and money into Washington. And this money has been pouring into Washington at such a rate that they're actually drowning in it. So the big secret of the candidates is, first, to keep you from knowing about the $44 trillion surplus, because they got to keep on collecting income tax to control you. They got to keep on taxing you for everything else, even the groceries that you buy, because they are addicted to it. They have to have that tax money. And in fact, as I say, they print their own money anyway. They don't need a penny of it, but they want to keep you under their thumb. They want to keep you enslaved, so the taxation is the way to do it. But both candidates got a little nervous, and they started talking about tax cuts. George Bush has talked about $1.7 trillion. Even Gore has said, well, instead of tax cuts, we'll give them more government programs, which is the Democratic way of life. They can't think of anything else. More government programs. But they are now attacking each other on the tax issue, but still don't tell anybody about the surplus. Now, the story about the surplus is leaked out first through the municipalities and the states. There was a writer who investigated, and he found out that each state and municipality published a comprehensive financial report which revealed that every one of these entities had stashes of many millions of dollars, and that they didn't need to levy any taxes because they had more than enough cash on hand to run the government. But of course they couldn't tell the people that, because the idea of taxation is control, not money. So now we find out the national government is in the same position. They've got this enormous surplus, but at the same time, when they talk about taxes, the editorial writers on all the major papers, Washington Post, they talk about what a tax cut will cost the government. If you cut taxes, you're taking money out of our poor, weak little government in Washington. I mean, you're just being selfish. And that's the way they feel about it. And the press, of course, echoes whatever the Federal Reserve wants them to say. They will say the most preposterous things, and they'll say it with true dedication, and they will try to convince you of it. In fact, when Dan Rather looks at you, and he looks with those soulful eyes, and all he's doing is selling the Federal Reserve program to the American people. But I have always had total faith in the American people that our innate resources and our determination, it's enabled us to survive these lunatics for over 200 years, and I think that we'll survive them a while longer. But what I want to see is more exposure of these people and their total corruption, and the fact, whether you hate them or not, they hate you. They hate you because they feel that they have to hate their victims. So that's why they hate you. They don't hate you because you wear the wrong clothes or not good looking. They just hate you because you're their victims. And they have to maintain that hate in order to carry on the terrible things that they do to you. They cannot treat you like human beings. In fact, I was down with George Hansen, Congressman George Hansen, a few years ago at Dallas, and they had an alert out for him at that time. And so we had our meeting, and we went across the street to a Holiday Inn to have a little lunch, and the government agents were looking for him. And I noticed he was a little nervous, but we went out a side door, and apparently these brilliant detectives from the government didn't see us leave, so they were totally in the dark as to where we were. And they're running up and down the street. Where's George Hansen? We're sitting there drinking coffee and talking. And so he went on up to Oklahoma, and they arrested him there. And George was quite a bit overweight. They put him into a tiny plane and put handcuffed his hands behind his back and flew him to Washington. And he almost got gangrene because they cut off all his circulation. Now I mention that because these government agents are always told to rough you up when they arrest you. They're not to be nice to you at all. They're to injure you, do anything they want, and make you regret the day that you ever criticized the government. And of course, George Hansen had put out a book criticizing the Internal Revenue Service. So they were really after him. And they put him in prison twice on trumped-up charges, and the charges were later reversed by appellate court. But he did serve the time, because in the time that it took to get through the appellate court, he had already served his time. But the Federal Reserve System itself is probably the most satanic institution in the United States. And it is the greatest moral threat, the greatest threat to your health, because everything that they do directly affects your daily life. Makes it more difficult, makes it more expensive, and it does have a terrible, burdensome effect on you, which affects you even though you don't know it. So I've been fighting them all these years because, well, when I was at the Library of Congress doing my research for the Federal Reserve book, I was there all the time anyway, so I joined the staff. And as soon as this book came out in 1953, the Library of Congress fired me. I was the only person ever fired from the Library of Congress for political reasons. And of course, I sued them. At that time, I did not have the legal experience that I have now. In fact, I've been into courts ever since. I found that if you're going to have any rights in this country, you got to go to court and you got to stay in court, keep filing lawsuits, and otherwise they're going to stomp you right into the ground. I got default judgments against the FBI, so now they don't bother me anymore. I got one for $50 million and one for $35 million, which I haven't collected yet, but it's on the books. I entered those judgments in the federal courts myself, because a judge does not enter a default judgment. You go to the clerk, and the clerk has to enter it. And so that's why they're on the books. And of course, the IRS harassed me for years. I went to tax court without a lawyer. I was myself the lawyer. And I had corresponded with the IRS lawyers for about a year before we went to court. And I had stipulated in there that I wanted the IRS to be charged for the fact that they had conspired to put me in a mental institution. The IRS and FBI together in 1959 conspired to put me in a mental institution, mainly because in 1958 I got Ezra Pound out of St. Elizabeth, so they were short one patient. So they figured that I would be a good replacement to bring the numbers back up, the statistics, to keep their budget going, you know. So J. Edgar Hoover issued personal orders to the top 5 assistant directors of the FBI that I be put in a mental institution. And so he got my records from the IRS, which was illegal, so the IRS was cooperating. So I had stipulated to the tax court that the IRS would have to deal with this conspiracy to have me put in a mental institution. So I go into the tax court, and I'm really excited because I'm finally going to run into these IRS lawyers. I wanted to see what they look like. I talked to them on the phone, we'd exchange letters, and I looked around. There was no lawyer from the IRS there. They wouldn't even face me in court. They sent in a young district attorney, and the judge said, well, you gentlemen go into a conference room and see if you can work this out. So I went into a room with this kid, and we were only in there a few minutes, and he agreed that they didn't have any deficiency against me. So we came out, and the judge said, have you gentlemen agreed? And we said, yes, we have. And he has no tax deficiency. And I walked out of tax court with a letter stating I had no tax deficiency. And I don't know anyone else that's ever done that. So I was speaking at a meeting in San Jose of tax people a few years later. And there were 3 guys there, Bill Benson and a couple of others, and they had all fought the IRS, but they had lawyers. And they had paid their lawyers a lot of money to fight the IRS. So after they spoke, and their lawyers had done a great job for them, and they had won their cases, and then I got up and gave my little spiel about how I went to tax court and didn't even have an attorney. Well, it sort of threw a wet blanket over everything, and they never invited me back again. So I wasn't bragging, but I was just telling the circumstances, and that you really did not have to have a lawyer if you had the truth on your side, and if you wanted to go in there and fight yourself. But people have been so terrorized that they're afraid to fight the government. And they don't realize the bureaucrats are more frightened than you are, because they're afraid of losing their cushy jobs. They have more to lose than you do. And I have never met a bureaucrat who would stand up and fight you. Never. If you stand up against them, they will crawl back into the woodwork. And believe me, that is a formula that works every time. Because they're not paper tigers, they're not tigers at all. These are just guys that are interested in making a good living without working. And you become a threat to them when you imperil this soft life that they have. And believe me, Washington, D.C., people live better than anywhere in the United States. Houses sell for $1 million up there. And these are clerks because they both work, they make good money, And interestingly enough, in the government, a lot of people never pay income tax. A lot of the bureaucrats don't pay at all. And nobody does anything about it. Because like I say, when you're in government, you're in law enforcement. And why should you enforce the law against yourself? So they don't do it. And they can get away with it. Some of those guys retire after working all their lives in Washington, still haven't paid any taxes. They don't come around and put liens against their houses. Because it's a government of them against you. You are going to pay the bills. And they're going to see to it that you pay the bills. And they're going to enact penalties against you. In fact, the first time I ever got a request for audit from the IRS, I read it over, and I thought to myself, well, this is very frightening. Here I am, alone in the world. I have nobody to fight for me, and I got to go down there, and they're going to take me apart. So I said, my gosh, I'm really terrorized. So the next day I went down and filed a lawsuit against the IRS agent for terrorism. And you know, to this day, I don't know anyone else that's ever done that. But that is the most effective thing you can do. Because if you're terrorized, why be ashamed of it? Admit it. And I'm easily frightened, so so I let them know that I'm scared to death. But as I say, when I went to the court, the IRS wouldn't even send their best lawyers or any lawyers in to even face me. So I still don't, to this day, don't know what they look like. Because naturally, I don't hang around the IRS building myself. And I have no idea what they look like. But the American people's future still lies ahead of us. We have to get over diseases like the Federal Reserve System, which is an aberration. As I say, it came in right after the Revolution. And we threw it out, and it came back again and again, and we threw it out. And now this present Federal Reserve System has overstayed its time, and it's ready to go. And we're ready to march on to a really great future of America. And believe me, it is a great future. The whole world looks to this country as the land of liberty, the land of opportunity, because here we get things done. But the biggest problem is that in order to get anything accomplished in this country, you have one obstacle, and that's the government of these crooks and robbers. And so we just have to put a stop to it. We have to get rid of these people. We have to let the citizens of America run this country. We have so long had a tradition that the real able people went into business, achieved things, and we let the incompetents run the government. We cannot afford that any longer. We need to root these people out 100% and put real business people into government. I think that any successful businessman who has had a good career, 30 or 35 years, should then go into government and clean out these rats and straighten out this mess. They talk about the mess in Washington, but the mess in Washington wasn't there when Washington was founded. The mess was created after the bureaucrats moved in, because that's all they know how to do. They don't know how to accomplish anything. They don't know how to build anything. You can go in every state capital, like here in Denver, it's the same thing. You have the incompetents running everything. I was in the Boston State House a couple of years ago, and believe me, there was such an odor of corruption in that whole building. Ingrown incompetence, and of the same crowd of tired thieves and liars running everything. And the people simply should not put up with it any longer. We have given them too much time. We have to tell them their time is over. We're taking back our country. And then we can move forward together. Because the great goals have still not been achieved, but they're there. We can still do it. We haven't lost anything except a lot of time and a lot of being Mr. Nice Guy. Right. I'm asking you, don't be Mr. Nice Guy any longer. Thank you.
Thank you so much. There's 5 minutes for questions if you have any. Get to the microphone, give us your name, and will you take questions?
Yes, I'll take questions. We'll also have a workshop later on today.
A workshop tonight.
But any questions right now we'll deal with.
We got time for 4 or 5 questions, so okay, go ahead.
My name is May Cornish.
Speak up, please.
My name is May Cornish, and he said we should do something about it. What do you suggest we do about it, all of us?
Well, there's one thing about these people. They're not bashful. They have never hid anything that they've done, so the record is clear, and that gives us the opportunity to move against them. Just go after them for what they've done. You don't have to imagine anything or make up anything. It's all on the record, everything they've done.
So you think we should be filing lawsuits? Is that what we do?
Well, lawsuits is the great peril of every bureaucrat. No bureaucrat wants to have a lawsuit filed against them. So I'd say that is the best way. And any citizen can file a lawsuit. Any citizen has the right under the Constitution to represent himself in court. All it costs you is the filing fee, which used to be $10. And when Ronald Reagan became president as a conservative revolution, they upped the fee from $10 to $150. I have to pay $150 fee today to file the same lawsuit I used to file for $10. But that you cannot get it on file until you pay the fee, unless you take a vow of poverty. And I think, too, that a lot of you in this room know that you wouldn't have to pay the fee because the Constitution requires gold and silver in payment. So if you don't have any, they can't accept the fee. So that's a good way out of it, too.
My name is Vernell Hemet, and I would like to know, I think that's a great idea. The unfortunate thing is the incompetence goes all the way down to the county commission, which means that the judges and the people down at the state house are all corrupt. How do we handle that problem? Just as citizens go down and file these liens against these bureaucrats?
I haven't filed liens against people. I sue them outright. Now, some people have gotten in a lot of trouble filing citizens' liens because the judges strike back. It really infuriates them. So, but you're right about the incompetence goes all the way down. I used to say even the janitor in the county courthouse was part of the courthouse gang because they don't let anybody into their group unless they're totally controlled, totally owned by them, and who will be totally obedient. So it is all the way down. It's just not in Washington. I don't say clean up Washington. Clean up every village in the country.
Thank you.
I'm Dan Pill. A while back ago, Eustace, you had that lawsuit against the Dow Jones in Boston. Whatever become of that? Do you remember when you sued them?
Yes. Well, what happened was I was scheduled to speak in Cape Cod, and Bo Greitz had been up there, and he said, look, those people are great up there. Why don't you go up? So I did. And so the local newspaper, the Cape Cod Times, printed a front page smear story against me, and the Greek priest still refused to cancel the engagement because he said it's a matter of honor. We've given our word, and I haven't seen anything about this gentleman. He has no criminal record. I have no reason to cancel the engagement. So they called him up and they said, if you allow Eustace Mullins to speak there, we are going to blow up the church and everybody in it. Well, this was a risk he didn't want to take, so he withdrew the meeting, which was never held, by the way, even to this day. That was over 10 years ago. So I sued the Cape Cod Times. After I sued it, I found out they were part of the Dow Jones Corporation, the Wall Street Journal. So that made it even better, because then you got deep pockets. So I sued them in Virginia, because there is a Dow Jones Corporation of Virginia. But my federal judge, who's been terrified of me for years, he always tries to get rid of me if he can. So he said, Mr. Mullins, he said, I don't have any jurisdiction, because the Cape Cod Times, of course, was published in Cape Cod, but it was owned by a company that was doing business in Virginia. So I said, well, I'll move the case to Cape Cod, which is what he wanted. He wanted to get me out of his court. He didn't care where I went. And so the judge up there dismissed it without a hearing. So I went to the courthouse, and they said, well, his own clerks told me he can't do that. So I refiled it, and he dismissed it again with prejudice, which means you cannot file it again. So that was the end of that lawsuit, but I've had 2 more lawsuits going in Massachusetts ever since, because the beauty of our legal system is, and it's for the lawyers, but it's for you too, when you start a case, they have it set up so it can never really come to an end. You can keep it going as long as you want to keep going back to court. In fact, I just reopened a case. They rendered summary judgment against me in October 13th, 1998, and I just reopened it on the grounds that I was in the hospital and didn't have a chance to appeal, which was true. And the judge knew I was under treatment at that time, and he still dismissed it. So I filed a petition to reopen. And I think I've really got them up against the wall. They don't know where to go on this one. So I do these things, and I sit back and see what they can do. And generally, they don't have an answer. One more question?
We've got to be quick now because we want to be fair to everybody.
Certainly.
Okay.
Okay, I'm Fritz Springmeyer from Oregon City. Eustace, would you talk about NORFED and real money instead of all this funny money we've been talking about?
Yes, NORFED is a system of currency started by the citizens themselves, and I'm a member of it, and they print their own money, and that money can be exchanged for any goods or services with anybody that's on the NORFED account. And you see, the thing about money is that if someone will accept it, it's a medium of exchange, but you have to find somebody that will accept it. In fact, when the Federal Reserve notes were printed after the Federal Reserve Act of 1913 was enacted in 1913, they weren't legal money. So finally, Congress had to pass the Legal Tender Act stating that Federal Reserve notes are legal tender. And that's the only way they could get people to accept them, because everybody knew it was phony money. So it's just a matter of getting it accepted, and we can do that anytime with our own money system. We don't need the Rothschilds. We don't need any of these people. It's just a question of working together and helping to build the nation.
Okay, thank you very much. Like everybody else, Eustace can go on and on and on, and you didn't get it any other books he has written, which are voluminous. One other thing, is Alex Merklinger here? Alex Merklinger? I just want you to know who he is. There he is back there. You don't even have to come up front if people will turn around. Stand up on that riser right there, Alex. Alex is from Santa Fe. I just want you to know he's broadcasting live from here tonight with some of our speakers, and you can ask him about his stations and where they are and so forth and so on, but I don't want you to know where he is. So we're glad to have him here from Santa Fe, New Mexico. Okay, thank you again, Eustace. Thank all the speakers of today. Workshops are tonight. Exhibits are now open and free to the public. You may meander